G'day, welcome back to another video. We are looking at lesson 15 today, acceptance and rejection of the popular culture, that being sitcoms. So again, don't forget to scroll right back up to the top of your course booklet, or flick through your pages rather, and sign and register the date in which you're completing this lesson. Let's get started. We'll start with breaking down the dot point first. So here it is, groups that accept and reject the popular culture. So when we're talking about groups, that's not limited to any specific prescribed type of group. The syllabus doesn't stipulate or limit us in that regard, so we can link it to almost any group that we like. So as with many things in society and culture, it's really advantageous to view those groups at micro, meso, macro levels, because that gets us thinking about different institutions, different types of groups that can be associated with popular culture of sitcoms. So for example, a micro group for this particular dot point you could look at is the family unit. A meso level group might be something like shopkeepers who operate at the meso level. Obviously they sell the product, so they typically accept the popular culture. And a macro level example might be the media, or if we're looking at globalized sort of communities, things like the LGBTQIA plus community, ethnic minorities, certain countries as a whole, that certainly can operate as a group at the macro level there as well. The other two sections we're going to be looking at then is, did they either accept or reject the popular culture? So accepting obviously meaning that they agree with it, they're happy to consume it, it's something that may align with their contemporary values and beliefs, and rejection being the opposite of that. So obviously any sitcoms that don't align with people's beliefs, they will reject, they will refuse to consume it, as an example there. So there are lots of different groups that will accept or reject a sitcom. There are certainly groups that will accept some parts or different types of sitcoms and reject others, so they might not reject the popular culture as a whole. So it's important to have that in the back of your mind. So say a family at a micro level, for example, might not completely ban sitcoms or reject it. They might only reject certain types of sitcoms, usually again due to the content and alignment with their contemporary values. And that's what most of it really does boil down to at the end of the day. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about this. It's not, do they blanketly accept or reject sitcoms as an industry? It's, although they can, for sure, we're more looking at the nuanced groups that accept or reject certain different sitcoms. So to explore that, the first activity we are going to do, if you look at this table here, we have an acceptance and rejection table, and then we have another table just above it with all these different statements. Your job is to categorize and sort these statements, the mix and match statements, and rewrite them into whether they either belong in the acceptance column or the rejection column. Now some of them are fairly straightforward. They might have the word accept or reject within them, or other words that denote something to that effect, like sitcoms being cancelled by contemporary audiences 10 to 15 years after the series stopped airing. Is that an example of accepting sitcom or rejecting it? I'll let you decide. However, this first activity is very much looking at the broad picture, and we're making some broad statements. So countries banning polarizing sitcoms, successful sitcoms being celebrated with awards at the Emmys. So we're looking at very kind of blanket examples of either acceptance or rejection there. If you're someone who, is really adverse to rewriting it out, you can certainly color acceptance in a green highlighter and rejection in a red or orange highlighter, if that is something that angers you or you wish to do that to save a bit of time. That's quite alright. But that's the first activity. So pause, do that, and come back to the video. Well done. Now that you've finished that, we're going to move on to the next activity, and this is where we're going to flesh out some of those examples. So on page 39 and 40 here, we've got two tables, another acceptance and rejection table, coloured in green and red, like so. What I've got here, breaking this table down, is all the examples of the mix and match statements that we've just used here. And I've just realised I've given you all the correct answers here. But anyway, I digress. What we've got here is all the things that are examples of acceptance that we have highlighted here. So I guess you can check your own work and tick it off to see if you've done it correctly. But we're going to expand on that. So if we were to ever be asked a question on this in the HSC, that we're really clear what groups that this particular example of acceptance relates to, and then we're going to expand on how and why it relates to them, and where possible we want to add in an example of a sitcom that we can draw back from our memories here. So I've done one as a full example here for acceptance, and I've done another couple as a full example down here on the rejection table. So we'll go through those, and then I've intentionally left some gaps here for you guys to fill out and work with your study buddies and either identify the group or level of society that it's related to, or explain the how and why, or sometimes doing both, depending on the example we're looking at. So we'll talk through the first one really quickly together. So our first example we're looking at is there is a higher number of consumer acceptance and popularity of contemporary sitcoms with progressive ideologies. So again, progressive ideologies, we're talking here about things like increased social inclusion. Whenever we're talking about a progressive ideology, it's usually something that aligns with contemporary social values. So for in Western society, we see progressive as very much moving forward and the right way to moving forward according to our cultural beliefs. So in sitcoms, this looks like having fair and equal representation of the LGBT community, having appropriate and non-stereotyped representation of ethnic minorities, black consumers particularly, because a lot of these sitcoms originate in America and the US, that is quite a focus point for sitcoms that originate there. And then also the concept and group of a blended family. So what we mean by blended family is typically what's called the nuclear family is made up of mum, dad, 2 kids. Blended families recognise that a lot of families aren't made up that way anymore like they used to be, and we've got a lot of different types of families. So instead of a mum and a dad, you might have a dad and a dad, or 2 mums, or you might have extended family living all in the same household. You might have your grandparent as your primary caregiver because your parents aren't around. You might be in a foster care system, but that's still considered family. So when we're looking at blended families, we're looking beyond the traditional role of mum and dad and 2 kids, and more looking at all the different family types that can exist out there. So certainly newer sitcoms, Modern Family is a great example of that, where that's becoming more common. Because in contemporary society, families are a lot more diverse than they used to be. That doesn't mean that other traditional nuclear family structures have disappeared or don't exist. That's not the case at all. But typically, higher number of consumer acceptance of sitcoms that cater to both blended and non-blended families. So typically, they're the ones that gain higher acceptance, and they're the groups that will accept it because of that. So an explanation of how and why that happens is that the content of the sitcom will align with current contemporary social values such as equality, acceptance of diversity, and valuing difference. So humour is then driven through unique characterization of the individual and not stereotypical tropes of social or cultural groups. So that's a really big one here, especially when we're looking at the types of groups here that are accepting it because of progressive ideologies. So remember, ideologies being a related course concept for popular culture, so it's really important that we've got a clear understanding of that. So an ideology is a belief in something and a particular way of viewing it. So when we're looking at sitcoms here and ones that get high level of acceptance, particularly amongst minority groups, which is particularly what's being illustrated there, the humour is driven through unique characterization of the individual. So we see that in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, for example, with Charles Boyle. So he doesn't represent the stereotypical masculine male figure. He loves cooking. He's a solo parent. He dabbles in arts that are considered traditionally feminine, like baking, and he's also very conscious of what he wears. However, all the humour directed at him isn't based on a stereotype or trope that he's a feminine man. It's more focused on his unique characterization, as that's just who Boyle is. That's part of his identity. So the humour isn't on that stereotypical tropes that we might see in older and previous sitcoms. Like if we look at Friends, for example, Chandler's made fun of because he's got the smoothest hands there is, and that's considered more of a feminine characteristic. That's not necessarily something that's unique to Chandler's identity. It's built in the joke is based off that stereotypical trope that, haha, it's funny because he's being feminine when he's a man. And we also see it in sitcoms like The Good Place. If you look at the casting of The Good Place, I might get an image up right now. there's varied ethnic representation here. But if you watch the sitcom here with a varied ethnic representation, it's not something that is drawn out in a really obvious way. It's more that their ethnic and their cultural identity is embedded in who they are as people. There's no jokes made at their cultural expense whatsoever throughout the entire series, and it's really clear that their cultural background forms part of their character and that it's not a focal point for the humour at all. So that's another example there of the contemporary sitcom being quite accepted due to that diversity. So there's a clear example fully fleshed out for you. I might just quickly talk through each of the examples that sit here and maybe give you a few ideas to see what you can write through, as I'm sure you're sort of dying for that. So if we look at the second one, successful sitcoms are celebrated with awards at the Emmys. So in case you're not aware, the Emmys is sort of like the Oscar nomination, Oscars being for movies, Emmys is for TV series, and obviously there's different categories as well. So comedy is one category that sitcoms typically win awards at. So of course that shows acceptance of the sitcom because they're receiving an award for their work, okay? It's a pretty straightforward one. The groups or the level of society that operates on is clearly macro. You've got actors, actresses, producers, networks, etc. being nominated for those things. Directors as well, you could put there as well. So I guess the reason or the how and why this promotes acceptance is that these awards are voted by numerous critics from the media. There's bodies that represent consumers that are part of the voting process. And obviously, although they don't have a formal vote, consumers definitely impacted that. You know, if a show doesn't have really high ratings, if it doesn't have high viewership, they're not going to be nominated for an award. And by extension, the ones that have high viewership and high ratings and high approval from the consumer fan base are ones like this who have a lot of progressive ideologies. So the Emmys aren't going to nominate a really controversial sitcom like South Park, although it's still very popular. That's not going to be nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award and win anything. Compared to something like, for example, Modern Family, which has racked up multiple Emmy Award nominations every year that it's out, again in part due to a lot of its diverse casting and some of the themes and contemporary values that they portray within the show. So that's an example there. If we look at consumers, they embed sitcom subculture into everyday life. So anything that might influence or change behaviour, language, values, that clearly shows acceptance of the sitcom because it's shaping social and personal identity. That operates on a micro level, obviously, because a range of consumers, if we're thinking adolescents, family, peers, so anyone that has any friends that use certain sitcom catchphrases within their everyday language. This could potentially also operate at a meso level as well. I know, and you might want to write that in because workplace culture, so meso level workplace. A lot of workplace culture sort of mirrors sitcom life, and so, for example, The Office, a lot of the language, behaviour and jokes that are from the sitcom The Office make it to a lot of corporate organisations, and you can see that with various different bits of paraphernalia they have around the place. If you look at the type of language and jokes that they use to crack down, that culture is embedded within a lot of workplaces around the world. And again, the how and why, because that content relates to their micro or meso level experience, like if we use The Office there for an example, they're more likely to accept it because it mirrors their reality. And if they do that in a humorous way, then it increases consumption and therefore shows clear evidence of acceptance because that's subculture at the workplace continues and will remain in continuity because people find it so relatable and embed it in their social identity at a meso level or their micro identity at a personal level. To extend on that as well, like when we're talking about behaviour and language and values, a lot of those themes that are depicted in sitcoms, people then replicate those values and behaviours in their real life. So the fact that, say for example, contemporary sitcom like Brooklyn Nine-Nine overtly challenges racism within the workplace within a particular episode, which we will watch later, might encourage consumers to replicate that behaviour and those values within their own workplace and call out racism and indecent behaviour when they see it. So it certainly definitely can operate at that meso level as well, but the same for micro level at families. Like the sitcom Modern Family, right towards the end of each episode, they have that mini segment where they're sort of talking about a life lesson that they've learnt from that episode. So whilst it's got that humorous tone, it's also got that message at the end of the episode, which is really value laden, and that can affect consumers, because again, they might mirror and replicate that behaviour, and it might change or reinforce their own cultural values and beliefs, or indeed shift or change them. So I might let you guys go ahead and do the next three, as I want to talk a little bit about rejection here as well. I might quickly touch on this bottom one because it seems in contradiction to this first one. So you can have, so this first one's looking at higher consumer acceptance because it aligns with progressive ideologies, but there's also an example of growing acceptance of countercultural sitcoms that don't align with mainstream social norms and values, because you've got to think that there are still groups within society, again that's looking at our dot point, that would technically reject progressive ideology sitcoms because it doesn't align with their personal values or beliefs. So there is a growing acceptance of some, what I would call countercultural sitcoms, one that go against, I guess, the grain of contemporary and progressive ideologies. So typically those groups, if you want to put that in here, can operate probably at all levels, to be honest, micro, meso and macro. You probably do have different groups there, but I guess the main group that would align with countercultural sitcoms are conservative groups, or groups that hold conservative values. So for example, a family with conservative values might operate at a micro level, and at a macro level you might have governments that are typically quite conservative. So we can see that some sitcoms are rejected in certain types of countries because they don't align with conservative beliefs that are relevant to that society. So an example that I've talked about here, because they have to create a target market for these conservative consumers in order to increase consumption for the full breadth of consumers. So for example, if anyone's ever seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, a hilarious show sometimes. It does push the boundaries a lot, but that sitcom is about, the whole main cast are just horrible, awful people. And as you can imagine, following their day-to-day life where they run a bar in Philly is quite countercultural, because the sort of things they get up to and do are just, as I said, horrible, because they are horrible people. Another example is The Office. Whilst not, I guess, as intense as It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, their content certainly, and very deliberately as well, challenges a lot of contemporary social values and perpetuates stereotype-based humour, as opposed to humour that's based on the unique characterisation of the individual cast members and characters. This one definitely, The Office and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, particularly perpetuates stereotype-based humour. And we saw that in the Office clip that we watched earlier this year, titled Diversity Day. Whilst that's a bit more of an overt example of how they've done it, they definitely play on that throughout the whole series. Michael Scott, the main character in particular, perpetuates a lot of that, as does Dwight. So they play on those cultural cliches as their humour and preference type for humour. So there's definitely a growing acceptance of that, because not everyone, because there's that kind of countercultural movement against mainstream social norms and values. Right, rejection table. So I might start on the bottom because I've got a few of those fleshed out. So one example we can look at is a clear rejection of westernized sitcoms. And again, that's due to a number of reasons, but the main reason that we're looking at that is because it doesn't align with the macro level cultural beliefs, typically, of certain countries. Typically those countries which are more conservative in their beliefs, or that their values don't align with Western culture's representation of certain values and concepts, for example gender, sexuality and things like that. So it can operate at all levels, so micro, meso and macro. So you can see a family or something like an Islamic community or a government of a particular country, so we can see all the different levels there, rejecting westernized sitcoms because it doesn't align with their cultural beliefs. So in particular, a lot of Islamic countries, such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia in Asia, for example, which might surprise a lot of people. It's actually got the most Muslim adherents out of any other country in the world. Indonesia does, as of this year, in 2023, time of filming. So a lot of those types of countries will ban certain sitcoms, such as Modern Family, due to their representation of homosexual couples, Cam and Mitch, and have often created their own version that aligns with their own cultural values. So there's a sitcom called Half Sang, which is produced in Iran, which is basically Modern Family, but a version that caters to that country's particular ideologies and beliefs around family dynamics and things. So typically we can see a strong rejection of westernized sitcoms for groups at micro, meso and macro levels where it doesn't align with their cultural beliefs. That sort of leads into this one as well. A lot of countries ban what we call polarizing sitcoms. So if something's polarizing, it's highly controversial. It splits opinion because of the controversial nature, because it's quite out there. So that's typically operating at a macro level with the government because they have the authority to ban a sitcom. So because of the highly, I guess the explanation of the how and why, an example, because of the highly discriminatory and offensive content or themes that are racist in nature or xenophobic in nature as well, could put that off the side here, xenophobic, Xenophobic. So xenophobic meaning fear of the other, particularly if they come from another country. It's irrational fear of the other. So for example, numerous countries, Vietnam, Russia and China, for example, they've banned South Park and Family Guy because they're highly racist and discriminatory to people from those countries and areas of the world. So that's a clear example of a rejection of the popular culture of sitcom. If we look at things like at a micro level here, parents not allowing their children or family to consume certain sitcom series, again that operates at the micro level. Very similar to this example here, it's because it might not align with the beliefs of families. So I've got a personal story here. So like for example, growing up I wasn't allowed to watch The Simpsons. Mum hated the fact that Homer would choke Bart, his son, as a form of discipline and punishment, and that was usually seen as humorous in nature. So I guess desensitizing its viewers to serious issues like domestic violence. So parents not allowing the children or family to consume a certain sitcoms because it doesn't align with their beliefs is an example there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just towards the example that I depicted there. There might be a various different examples. So a lot of conservative and religious households don't like families watching certain sitcoms because it might be blasphemous towards their religion or belief system. Or for example, the content just might not be appropriate for young families that have kids around. So something like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which has a bit of swearing in it, would be, or South Park, which has a lot of swearing in it, would be very inappropriate to have around a young household. So that's another example, and I guess a how and a why there. It goes against their contemporary values, and that might encourage, especially if it's obscene behaviour that children don't want to be a part of, it might encourage them to replicate that within the household, and that can go against the behaviour and standards of society that those parents want to instill in their children. Also another clear example here with consumer groups rejecting sitcoms that stereotype and or are discriminatory in their humour. So this kind of looks at the meso-macro level. So this is sort of a counterpoint to this one. So whereas a lot of people accept a sitcom that has a great representation of minority groups, they will reject sitcoms that stereotype or are discriminatory in their humour within contemporary society now. So I guess the groups or level of society of people that would typically reject this is the LGBT community and the ethnic minorities, blended families. I think what you could also add here is like the common consumer. Like I guess even whilst minority groups definitely reject it, a lot of the dominant group in society or dominant cultural group can also reject this because the contemporary social value typically, and when we're talking typically I mean most people, particularly in Western countries, are definitely more progressive leaning nowadays than they are conservative leaning, would also reject this. So an example of that can be sort of twofold. Example one is that most current and contemporary sitcoms that are being made in the last few years don't feature humour that is discriminatory or stereotypical in nature. What you'll find is it's just older sitcoms and reruns of that which still have those jokes in, but contemporary sitcoms that are currently being made in the current market don't feature that or have very minimal reference to it at all. So from, I guess, a producer's level, straight off the bat, they're rejecting that as a humour style, and so they're going more towards the unique characterisation of individuals. The second sort of part, or an example, can be seen in low streaming or lack of success for sitcoms in contemporary society that do discriminate. They don't get much viewership at all. So, for example, the rehashed version of 2.5 Men, where they replaced Charlie Sheen with Ashton Kutcher, they tried to keep a very similar style of humour, and it fell really flat. You know, there was only two, maybe 3 seasons of the new version, but it got really poor ratings. It didn't really do as well as the previous 9 or 10 seasons because they kept that kind of stereotypical and discriminatory humour in place throughout. And then lastly, we have an example of sitcoms becoming cancelled by contemporary audiences 10 to 15 years after the series has stopped airing. So you have sitcoms that were potentially very popular in the day. I guess 2.5 Men is an example that we can look at there. But since have been cancelled and rejected by consumers. This can operate at all levels, micro, meso and macro. The level that's most apparent though would be macro level, because you have this globalized rejection sort of happening and being exacerbated by social media and people's ability to have public discourse online about it. So a really clear example of this is a rejection of certain sitcoms. So like The Simpsons, for example, a lot of groups in society, particularly those from ethnic minorities and backgrounds, sort of cancelled the sitcoms because of their representation of characters, particularly Apu. He actually got written out of the show due to consumer pressure, so a lot of consumers started to reject that kind of humour and cancelled it and refused to watch the sitcom The Simpsons until they rectified that issue, and they wrote Apu out of the show because of that. And then sometimes it can be cancelled due to things not relating to the content itself at all. So for example, if we look at That 70s Show, that's been cancelled now because actor Danny Masterson, who played Steve in That 70s Show, due to him becoming a convicted rapist and sentenced to prison, consumers reject and have not watched that sitcom. It's been cancelled because they don't want to be seen as supporting or laughing at someone who, during the time of filming of that particular sitcom, was doing heinous acts like that. And again, I guess it all really does relate back to contemporary values. You know, people don't want to be seen as supporting, and rightly so, I guess. Don't want to be seen as supporting a show that has that kind of baggage hanging over it, and a lot of the public discourse and macro level rejection of that was quite clear, and we can see that sort of being really impacted by the rerun of the show that they did, called That 90s Show, where the producers of the show decided not to call him back at all. And so this was prior to when he was officially convicted. There was just an allegation at that stage in a legal sense, but many consumers were already cancelling that series of sitcoms because of that. So there's a bit of a debrief on groups that accept and reject sitcoms as a popular culture. What I'd like you to do as the last thing for this lesson is answer this question here. So account for groups that accept or reject one popular culture. Now you notice there are a few things underlined in this question. The S here, meaning plural, so give me more than one group, that accept or reject. So you have to choose one and then write a 5-mark essay on that. We know what the account for verb means. Make sure you cube the question, circle the verb, underline key terms, box any qualifying statements, and expand on key ideas. Alright, beautiful. Look forward to marking that. Thank you very much. Have a good one. Bye.